Alrighty, so we will get started with our second session for today. So our second session is around the nuts and bolts of writing an introduction. You will have noticed, or you may have seen within the communications, this is the first part of these sessions. So if you are interested in stage 2, then obviously that will be run at the SMANS annual conference in December, but that will be spoken about shortly. However, for those associations that are joining us online today, one part of this session will encourage you to think about writing your journal introduction. And if you are interested, we are going to open it up to the associations to submit an introduction for academic review if you are interested. So please await further communications around where you will need to submit that and the potential due date to have that specific introduction that you may write reviewed or peer reviewed by senior academics, editors and the likes of those people in the field that will be able to provide some sort of guidance towards that introduction. Anyway, I don't want to steal the show of Jordan and Tracy, so I will leave it over to you, who are going to give us an introduction around the nuts and bolts of writing an introduction.
Perfect. Thank you. Tracy is just saying, but I feel like you guys are so far away, so we might just come up here. Yeah. Awesome. So, yeah, so as Ellie said, we're going to talk through the nuts and bolts of writing an introduction, obviously for a journal article publication. Awesome. So I'm going to introduce Tracy first, because she's much more important than I. But Tracy, we have a cool sort of wing person style going today in that Tracy has extensive experience as an editor. I believe she's only 3 people who have actually been the editor of our 2 major journals, which is kind of awesome. Combined with a rather younger person, I have some event experience, some research experience, of course, and journal, leisure, everything. But we're going to work ourselves through this stuff. You guys know much about what today's planned. So
just say, you know, draw on our experience today or this afternoon. It feels like it should be lunchtime now. So feel free to put either your hand up here if you're in the room or online. Ask questions as we go through, because this isn't meant to say just us imparting our wisdom and our experience. It's also about giving you the opportunity to ask some of those burning questions that you might have as well.
Yeah, exactly. And so as I was saying, Tracy just said, today's part 1. It's much of a conversation. So we know that all of you are writing, you're thinking through. So stop us, ask questions. We're obviously going to provide a presentation. And our hope really today is, as it said on the board, to inspire you to advance your own writing. And then more communication will come out about this after. But the idea from here is then you go away, you work with your supervisor, you work with your peers, and you work with the resources in our presentation, if you will, and you work on that introduction. And then you'll submit it at some point in time to the SMANS group for part 2, which as of right now includes Tracy, Pam, one other editor of SMR, previous editor, and then a couple of the editorial board members. So you have a rather awesome group of people to be getting that experience from. And we'll take you through essentially a 1-day workshop of building that, refining that, going through those tricky points, and then how to go from there. All right, so our presentation basically has 4 sections. So we're going to go over what the actual introduction is, how to write it, go through some key examples, some published ones, and then a rather in working progress one that I'm currently doing with some colleagues to show some of the stages, and then some of our reflections and strategies for the future.
And just want to say that we're providing some tips and tricks, but you know, you need to infuse your own personality into this, your own passion, your own way of looking at the world, because that's really important as well. Otherwise, we could just ask ChatGPT to, you know, if I'm doing a topic on this, what's a good introduction look like? And it'll give you something probably full of mistakes. But, you know, it's really important to reflect on what you want to say, how you want to say it. We'll talk about this from our perspectives, but then you need to not just take this as a template and, you know, fill in the words, but think about how it relates to what you're doing and what you want to say and what message you want to get across.
Exactly. And that's to probably answer most of the burning questions in the room. Today is not about giving you one template to go forward, put your notes in and then you get published. It's about providing opportunities to work through that so that, as Tracy said, you can inject yourself into the paper rather than just doing a paper that looks like everyone else's paper, perhaps. So the introduction. There we go. Oh. So I actually went and looked at, I guess, Oxford Dictionary's version of what an introduction is to start. And interestingly enough, essentially the three types of an introduction that you can have, or the three components to it, are all things that will happen in your paper. So of course, first and foremost, it is actually the introduction of your bigger paper. Second, you are introducing someone or something to a different group. I once sat in a panel that tried to explain a paper as you have two people who are the heads of their research areas having a conversation. You're at a cocktail party with them. How do you walk up to them and inject yourself in that conversation enough that it contributes to it, they continue talking, and they want to include you? Or is what you're saying just going to be, hey, cheers, nice to meet you, keep on with your day? So you are introducing yourself or the research you're doing specifically to the greater conversation that's happening. And then third, introduction of something. So bringing that thing that you're introducing into existence might be new to those people having that conversation. Person 1 and 2, maybe talking about something that's been talked about for years, and you're going, hey, here's a new perspective to think about this. That obviously entices you in the conversation and keeps you going. So depending on the type of paper you're writing, you might be including all of these things. You might be focusing on one or two, but chances are as your career progresses, you'll be thinking through all of them. Now, I'm a bit of a quote person, and these two quotes certainly resonate with me when talking about paper writing and introduction. So the first one's by Mark Twain. It's, I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one instead. One of my PhD supervisors used to say that she would start writing her introduction, and when it got too long, that would turn into her literature review. That happens very often. And as we all probably know, the difficulty of saying your one purpose in a sentence or your contribution in a sentence rather than how easy it can be in 4 or 5 sentences. The second quote by Stephen King is, if I can get the first paragraph right, I know I can do the book. And this is sort of how I look at actually writing the paper. I know that if I can get an introduction right, I can get the paper right. Of course, I've already collected data and conceptualized a bit. However, as a current example, I've been working on this paper, the one I'll show you shortly, with a colleague, and I probably spent 4 months figuring out the introduction, which sounds like a really long time because it is, and because the data was already collected, the paper was conceptualized, et cetera. But once that was dialed and tight where we wanted it to, it's now taken me about a month to write the remainder of the paper because everything was already paved the path for me. So that's kind of how I look at why it's so important in and of itself. So the way that I kind of think about this and the key points I want to iterate to you, and I've had this discussion, Tracy and I have talked about this, I've talked to other editors and editorial board member individuals, and they almost view the introduction as a reviewer threshold. I can biasedly tell you that if I review a paper, I either know I'm going to eventually accept the paper or reject it after the introduction, which is kind of a terrifying but truthful reality. And most people I've had conversations with say the same. And that's because in the introduction, I know if you have engaged with the right literature. I know if you've told me something novel and interesting that actually contributes to our literature. And I know that you've been able to do it in such a succinct and tight way that I'm confident you can certainly expand on it going forward. However, if you haven't given me that one sentence where I know what the paper's about, or I see that you haven't engaged with perhaps the right literature or authors, all of a sudden I'm skeptical of your ability to do so. So for example, you finish this introduction that's really well written, and we get to your theoretical or your literature background, and you don't have certain areas. Biasly, as the reviewer, I know that if I provide that comment to you in the revisions, you will be able to address it and do so going forward. On the opposite side, if you haven't, I'm skeptical as a reviewer. It kind of puts you in a negative reality, but we're also talking about humans reviewing your papers, and this is how it sort of works. This is very much how I viewed it, but then when talking with Tracy and with other people, it came to be a bit more of the norm. Do you want to
Yeah, well, humans are reviewing them now. Maybe eventually bots will be reviewing the papers, but we bring in our subjectivities when we're starting to read a paper. And as Jordan said, you start to make judgments about the importance of the paper and the research, the storyline, the narrative? Are you able to actually convince the reviewer, and therefore, if it gets published, the readership, that this is worth going beyond page 1 or 2?
Exactly, yeah.
And one of, we talked about this, one of the things that really annoys me is people who go to the specifics in the first paragraph or two and don't show that they have a broader idea of where the work sits in the field. And secondly, overclaiming that, okay, this is the first study that's ever been done in the world in this area, and making all these generalizations without any substantiation. I think that's the other thing that you just have to be careful of. Yes, it's important to you. Yes, you know that when you eventually get to talking about your specific research, it is making a contribution, it is unique, but it's hard, you'd be hard pressed to say that no one's ever done anything that's even remotely connected to what you're doing in your research. So just be mindful of that. Don't overclaim. Make sure you tell that story and that narrative to draw in your readership, whether it's a reviewer or once it gets published, people reading your articles as well. And I'll get onto this later, don't just throw in every reference you've got that you've ever read into that introduction, just to say, I know the field, here's a claim and there's 100 authors. And then a lot of us, when we're reviewing, we know who has written what. And so if we see that here's a sentence and it says, Taylor et al., 2021, oh, I didn't say that. I didn't talk about that in that paper.
Yeah.
Or for a lot of us reviewers and editors who have seen a lot of work as it comes through, we know our papers pretty well that have been published in the last 10 or so years in our journals. So just be mindful that you're writing to an educated audience.
Yeah. And that speaks to the subjectivity of the bias in a bad way, if you will, sometimes, because as Tracy said, you don't get stuck in the weeds, don't go into things that are broad. You will get there eventually. But when you do that in the introduction, you signal to the reviewer that you're starting in the wrong place, that you haven't built your story appropriately, or you haven't given them information they want. The specifics might be important, but you haven't shown that you can get there in a logical way for a reader, not just for you, the expert, and the reviewing team who's an expert. And as Tracy also made a great point, not only are you human working through it, but your reviewers are as well, of course. And they're going to know the papers you're talking about. They're going to know if you cited this person, but you should have cited this person, for whatever the reasons are. So working through those specifics and thinking through it a bit more with this kind of threshold mentality is really important. So just to summarize those key points, the first one is to highlight, obviously, your important topic to the field, but through conversations, Tracy made this really clear, and the journal. And that becomes really important to remember that you're not just trying to contribute to a field, absolutely you are, but you've chosen a journal for a reason. A very common reality with doing reviews is you often submit the review to the journal that had the most publications that you reviewed. That makes sense, right? It's the same thing for if your conversation on A is dominantly in journal A. You would go there. Well, what are you advancing there? Now, you're not, of course, comparing journal and journals, but there's a reason you're going to this journal. So make sure you align with its conversation as well. That's especially important from a reviewer perspective, because chances are you're going to have the reviewers who reviewed all the papers that you are citing. The second point, demonstrate your key understandings of key concepts. We'll get into this like theories and phenomena, but make it very clear from the start what it is, defining it, as well as your engagement with the right literature, which kind of summarizes what Tracy and I are talking about with who you're citing. You don't need to cite 10 people, but you do need to cite the right people for key concepts, key theories, in relation to your field and your journal. Identifying a novel way to advance the field's knowledge. So kind of going back to that conversation, what is the one sentence that tells me this is what's going to happen? What's the one sentence you can constantly go back to and should go back to throughout your paper? And then finally, and I like how this person said it, you need to give enough insight to make sure that the story you've told me you're going to do, you can actually do it. As a reviewer, I'm almost looking to invest in you. Can you give me enough of a nugget to know, like, yep, here's my investment. this is going to be an awesome paper. I confirm that this is going to be something that's really important for the field. So, any questions while I just kind of pause for a second? Yeah.
Just to add one thing, Jordan. So, and we talked about this before, is the title of your paper is really important. And in the introduction, make sure that you align the title of your paper with what story you're telling. It sounds like a no-brainer, but I can tell you a number of submissions come in and the title says it's about this. And then you start reading and you read and you read and you're saying, oh, I'm not seeing that in the introduction at all. You know, where is that particular concept? So make sure that you've got that alignment.
Yes.
I have a question around the title.
Yeah.
Do you have any bias or distinction for titles that contain a little funny or a quote or something versus titles which are very explicit with what the paper's about?
So the quote's an interesting thing. I'll get to that in a second. I think your key concepts need to absolutely be in your title. I'm currently reviewing a paper at ESMQ, and I essentially send feedback saying, based on your title, I thought the conversation was about this and this, but it's actually about this and this. And that's not a bad thing. You just need to change your title because I'm now confused of where things are going. So if you're going to have a theory in there that's really key, like you're looking to advance a certain theory, say that, advancing X theory. From a quote perspective or that sort of fun gimmick that we all like to put, I love doing it. I think it's a nice soft entrance into the paper. I've heard from reviewers, sometimes a great strategy as an author is to take a quote from someone that you collected data from and to insert that in, something that's really strong and powerful that can capture whatever your narrative is. But to kind of Tracy's point, the title is almost the formal way of saying what that linchpin sentence of your entire narrative is. So if that can be explained through a nice quote or a gimmick, if you will, plus some formal writing, that's what I would do. Yeah, does that answer your question? Okay.
Have you got an example, Harris?
Yeah.
Or you don't want to give it away, it's commercial and confidential.
Trade secret. Just my current title of my paper is very formal and very rigid, straight to the point. So I was thinking maybe I should spice it up or put a bit of flair on it.
Fair enough. Do you want to share your title with the group?
I'll be presenting later today.
Okay, perfect. I'll ask a question. All right, so let's go into how to write an introduction. And as we said earlier at the start, this is not going to be a very basic guide on what to do or what you should do. There's several ways to think about how you wish to do this. So hopefully it just kind of encourages you to think through different sources, think through your own kind of biases and what you are looking to have done. So, as I said, various sources. I've tried to compile sort of what I think is a popular 3 that you might look to. A publisher, Elsevier, Taylor and Francis, anyone, they all have guides on their websites that you can look through. These guides are going to be a bit more about setting the rules, kind of formal structure, but there are a lot of interesting notes to help you with. Elsevier has one that's make hook, line, and sinker, the art of crafting engaging introductions. And I'll go through that in a little bit. The second one, and this is probably where a lot of my sort of writing development started, is through what your supervisors tell you to do. I'm sure many of you have experienced the same thing. Supervisors, of course, traditionally have had long, successful careers. They know a thing or two about what's going on here. They are working through many of the things you've already worked through, and they're kind of also imparting their sort of strategy on you without necessarily knowing it, especially given how much they review your own work probably. And then third, there are lots of journals that do editorials. So editors or associate editors of journals at the time might write a couple page document that goes in the journal around this is the type of writing we're looking for. Here's some strategies on how to do this. A really strong example, Academy of Management does this for their review and their journals. So I've written one on the board, but we'll go through it in some specifics. All right, so publisher, so our Elsevier example. So they set 4 rules basically on how they hope people or try to help people write an introduction for their vast array of journals. So the first one is to locate the topic of your research within the broader field and have a general overarching statement on the specificity of your study. Kind of what we've talked about already. People are having conversations. What are those conversations? Where does your conversation fit? Rule 2, do not attempt to build suspense. You don't need to make an overarching claim it's the best thing in the world. You don't need to wait until the last sentence of the introduction to say what you're actually going to do. Rather, present all the necessary information you need about your study up front. Make it easy for the reader. One of my former supervisors once said she almost always reviews papers on a Friday night with a glass of wine and some pizza. Milena.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I knew who you were talking about.
Exactly, yeah. And she's like, just make it easy for her. She's like, if I'm enjoying wine, I'm reading your paper, I'm liking it, done. Rule 3, explain why the results, findings of your study are relevant. Establish the study's importance that will pique the reader's interest. So this kind of goes back to, can you complete the story? You've told us there's this thing that we need to experience or we need to explain or explore. Awesome, check, check, check. Can you actually do that, or have you just given all of us a really great idea to go do ourselves? And then the final rule is outline any key trends, citations that need to be in this introduction. This is your signal that you are in the right research area, that you're talking about the right people, the right main documents or bodies of work that have really inspired not just you, but your entire field. Second example, and this is the red wine drinking Milena Friday night, it's called ABT. So one of my former supervisors in Ottawa, Milena Perrant, she thoroughly enjoys writing styles and learning about them. And she often takes like Harvard online writing courses. So she basically came back from this writing course and said, all right, we've got this new idea. It's called the ABT method. It's extremely hard. It's essentially, I'm going to say 5 sentences to write your entire paper. And we were asked to do that for our dissertation. But when you start to work through it, it makes a lot of sense. So the first thing, A, is and. We know X and we know Y. B, but we don't know Z. This is important because. Therefore, I'm going to do exactly what you've already said you probably should do. So it's a very simple method, but it aligns very much with everything we've already talked about and our publisher's example as well, and just tying these same concepts. What are the things that we need to know from the field level, the journal level? Make sure you're citing the right person, the right papers that inspire this work. But what don't we know? And why is that important for us to know? Our 2 people are having a conversation at the cocktail party, and you come over and say, yeah, but what about this? And they go, that's interesting. But, and then you already have your answer of, it's important because X and Y. And then you say bye, and you go do that study, and then submit it to them. And then they love it. You get published. That's the ABT method. And it's only, of course, one supervisor method. I'm sure other supervisors have other methods to work through, but something to consider as you guys are working through. So this editor example. So Brian Connolly, so I'm at Deakin University. Brian Connolly is in Auburn, but he has an adjunct type position at Deakin. So he was here last year at the end of his 3-year tenure as a Journal of Management editor. And as a bit of a tidbit story, which I just found interesting, while he was editor, it was during the COVID era, and he said he had about 5,000 submissions over those 3 years and made it his personal job to read every submission, which I don't know humanly how that's possible, but that was his goal. And what he formed from this is that he realized people are really bad at writing introductions. So some of his work that I've talked to as well has helped this presentation, but he actually presented a very specific 6-step process for how he would do them. And it's dominantly an empirical standpoint and a quantitative one, so I apologize for that, but just provides a bit of an example of an editorial example. So in the first sentence, as Brian says, he wants you to frame the key concepts, theory, and or phenomenon. Make it really clear what the specific nuts and bolts of the paper is about. Then for the rest of that paragraph, in about 2 or 3 sentences, and this is, he said, what's probably the hardest thing, is can you summarize the entire field of research on that key concept, phenomenon, theory in 2 to 3 sentences? Again, going back to our fun quotes, you can get the first paragraph right, you can get the book right. After you've done that, he wants you to establish the importance of your phenomenon. So big fan of having stats in there. 80% of people have this, or billions of dollars are invested to this. Something that's really clear and sharp that pulls out and makes anyone go, yes, this is an important thing for us to be looking into. Then his third paragraph almost always starts with the word however, given, because. That negative hook word that makes you go, oh, we're missing something. And he wants you to specifically highlight, omission of information, attention. There's 2 bodies of literature talking about this, but we don't actually know which one's right. There's some sort of conflict happening. Those are examples where you say, this is what we're missing, the but. This is the reason why that but's important. Then your 4th paragraph, again, this is the very quantitative part. We test our ideas. He almost starts every paper by saying this, by going into, this is the thing we need to do. So we're going to do this through X. And if there's anything novel or super interesting in his data collection or analysis, he recommends putting in a sentence to kind of sharply make the reader and the reviewer go, oh, that's interesting. That's a great way to do this. Then finally, he finishes his introduction with a contribution paragraph where he explicitly says what his key contributions are. Now, one of the papers I'm currently working on is with a colleague in the organizational behavior type area. And we're writing this paper, and I kind of write a couple sentences like, here's the general contributions that we're doing. And he's like, oh, should we be more explicit? And I'm like, sure, why do you think that? And he goes, oh, in OB papers, we literally say in our intro, we make 3 contributions. Contribution 1 is, contribution 2 is. So this is a very direct way of saying it. And as Brian would add and specifically emphasizes, finish your paragraph with something punchy and pithy. Something that makes the reviewer and the reader go, I need to keep reading. This is just going to be the best Stephen King novel I've ever found in my life.
I do have a question on mine.
Oh, yeah.
It says, could you analyze this using the real example and how we can navigate through?
Absolutely. We will be getting to that.
Okay.
That's perfect. So those are examples of different sources you may work with. Yes, Harrison.
So the publisher example that you went through before, you mentioned not to build tension because the reviewer's reading your paper with a pizza and wine on a Friday night, whereas the Brian Connolly method says to build tension.
So different types of tension.
What would you say is the better approach when you're reviewing, with or without tension?
So the tension Brian's talking about is if there's tension in the literature.
Right.
So this is specific in his butt area, that this is what we're missing. Are we missing something because we're just clearly missing it? Or are we missing something because we've looked at this phenomenon from 2 different ways, and that's a tension in how people are looking at things. So you're looking to explore that tension. So it's just a different term of the word tension.
Or sometimes we call it the gap, like you're looking to identify the gap in the literature and then how you're going to approach it. I'd say from a lot of submissions that I have either reviewed or handled as editors, one of the biggest mistakes that people make is on this one, starting with that 2nd paragraph. So starting with the general context and maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs on that broad context, and then getting to what you're doing. And this method here is much more explicit, and you can see the alignment between the 3 approaches. It's very, very clear. I mean, one is probably a bit more precise than the other, but it gives you a sense of how am I going to craft this story, as Jordan was saying. And the other thing I would say here is Jordan mentioned that, these manuscript will go out to reviewers from a certain body of reviewers for that particular journal. Now, you may submit it to, let's say, you submit it to Journal of Sport Management, and you've written it a particular way. And then maybe it doesn't get through, and you think, oh, well, I'm going to submit it to International Sociology Review or Sport and Society. That's a very different introduction. So the journal, you need to be aware of what the journal scope is, where it wants to make the contribution to the field, and frame your paper accordingly. And the introduction helps that. I must say, and take out anything that suggests you've put it elsewhere. I can't tell you how many papers we've had into one journal, and at the bottom it's got another journal's name. So it's clear that it's been written for that journal or it's been framed for that journal. So if you're putting something for example, sport economics, the way they write and the way they expect the submissions to come in and the introduction to be framed is very different from sport management review. And as editors, we can immediately recognize when something's been flipped from obviously being rejected from another journal.
Yeah, especially when they're from different areas.
Yeah.
I do a lot of event-based research, so sometimes I go to a leisure journal or an events journal or a sport journal, and those are small things to think through, but they become really important. And when you review them, it's so blatantly obvious that that's where it's come from and things haven't been changed enough to meet the journal in that specific field. And just to add to Tracy's point, this Brian Connolly example, Journal of Management's a very quantitative journal. So he's built this based on, it's not just his own intuition, it's based on the submissions he's had. So this is very much how a management type person may want to think, whereas it might be slightly different for the field you're looking at. And that's where, when we'll get into this more, but when we talk about reading and writing, are you reading to understand the concept and theory you're reading? Are you reading to understand the structure of someone's paper that's been accepted? Are you reading to understand the commonalities between all the introductions in a certain journal you're looking for? Like, there's very different ways to read a paper, and I know that I still dominantly read a paper for the sake of the content, but there are also ways to read it to learn about styles that work. And we'll take you through some examples shortly, specifically in sport management, and this hopefully answers the online question, but you'll start to see how things actually align a lot more when you read it from that perspective. So, key things to consider. We've talked about this at length, but we'll just summarize. Not all introductions will look the same. And I hope that somewhat gets resonated through our examples. The concepts are all similar, but the way of doing that is not necessarily going to be identical as we go forward. This can, of course, also differ based on if it's an empirical paper, a conceptual paper, or a review type paper. You still need to set your hook. You still need to explain what you're going to do, but how you look into doing those things will have its own flair for you to consider. And that's where I personally like to start with a template paper sometimes, or reading through other similar papers in the past and see how they've done it and how they've worked that narrative. As we have iterated from the start, there is no perfect template. So don't just take Brian Connolly's because it's the simplest 6-step solution. I personally can't stand working with it because I constantly get tripped up between the first 2 paragraphs. But it's a great place to start and to think through. And just simply reading Elsevier's document or reading editorials will get you thinking about the way that's the right template for you as you grow. And the growth is something I really want to talk about because I certainly don't write introductions or papers the way I did a year ago or 2 years ago or 5 years ago. And having read, for instance, my supervisor's work over the extent of their career, you see how things change. So today, what you start thinking through, it's okay if those things advance, and they should advance as you advance, okay? Especially as your field conversation advances as well. Which gets to no specific template will hold the same test of time. And the order of your introduction will be based on your argument. Yes, so again, no perfect template. Figure out the key concepts you need to have, what process works well for developing that narrative, and go forward from there. Now, on top of all these concepts and sort of this order we're talking through, we also just want to briefly talk about sort of more formal things to consider. Word selection. So not only your key concepts that you need to bring in, but how are you defining them? Who is going to be aware of this? Who is reviewing these definitions? I use the term mega sport event all the time in research. I don't necessarily need to define it, but for sometimes I really do. You might be using, like Harrison's example, the word tension. Now it's just an example from previous, but there may be specific definitions for that word in certain fields. It's always important just to ensure that you have made it clear from the start, this is what I mean. And then a reviewer goes, yep, check, I stay with that the whole time, other than assuming they know. Consistency of language then, of course, becomes important. If you're going to use the word tension as a purposeful concept, don't call it something else going forward. Keep it as tension. It's not just sometimes boring, but as a reader who's reading a 10,000 word document, I'm constantly signaled to that word, and that's what Harrison meant in the first page. That's what the theory is, that's what the concept is. As Tracy pointed out, and this is more of the editorial knowledge, your word selection can equal the reviewer who's reviewing your work. Not just on terms of this is the topic area they are, but specific work, specific theories are really keen ways that a reviewer basically has a list of topics and theories they're supposed to be reviewing. So if you've put in social exchange theory, even though you only talk about it for 2 sentences, that might pop up for myself to review that. And then I might be confused as the person on there for social exchange theory why theory is not being discussed about much. So the words you're choosing to use, not just the keywords, but the specific words in your introduction, your paper especially, will be used by an editor, but also by systems like ChatGPT or AI systems, which will pull out the keywords that you're using a lot. I don't understand how this works specifically, but I imagine if Harrison used the word tension 72 times in his paper, I'll stop picking on you after this, but that's the most important or the most used word in his document. An AI system is probably going to go, oh, tension's important. Tracy studies tension. Tracy will review Harrison's paper. It seems simple, but that's probably how it kind of works, right?
Yeah, and Tracy gets the invitation to review and says, I have no idea about this area or this topic, but maybe I'll review it.
Yep.
Or I really don't agree with what they're proposing, or don't say that I'm going to be able to judge that and reject the review. But Jordan said there a lot of journals now are increasingly selecting reviewers based on what's in the introduction and based on an AI scan of words. And it's actually scary, I would say, to some extent, to the reviewers that are being asked to review papers. So as an editor, we will see a list pop up from the publisher, and this is more in the, let's say, the publishers who manage online open access journals. And you might have a list of 20 people and you go and choose those, send out the invitation to review.
Yeah.
All 20 say no, and then the system takes over, the bot takes over, and it starts sending out the invitations. And as an editor, you don't even get to choose whether those reviewers are relevant or not. So just, something to, I guess, behind the scenes to be mindful of.
Well, and it comes back to, are you checking in your journal who's publishing similar concepts? So for example, I've published a paper with theory of planned behavior. I know it basically, but it's not a theory I traditionally work with. But I've had review requests for marketing research, which I don't know much about, but because they use a similar theory. So while I'm not going to review that paper, someone might say they will. I think the moral of the story, what's important is if you're going to this journal, have you searched in the journal your key concepts and your key theories to then see how people in that journal have talked about it, who they potentially cited, and what types of conversations are happening. Just because someone does a marketing paper versus a management paper doesn't mean that the theory is not still relevant in that same journal. But when we think about paper writing from our perspective, we often don't go there first. So you've checked off writing stuff and reading stuff for your paper, but have you also done so from a journal reviewer perspective as well? Does that make sense? Yeah, head nods, good. All right, which this connects to our referencing. So what are the most influential papers and who are the most field shaping scholars in your area, in your topic? If there's a constant definition use that definition. Don't try to revolutionize your world by using someone when everyone's used a certain person since the 80s. That's okay. If the paper's to revolutionize it, of course, go ahead. But having that one author is more important than having the 20 that you've read. And that signals to the reviewer, you know what you're talking about. You've started in the right place. Now, Freeman's 1984 stakeholder theory should be referenced in your paper if you're doing a theory on that. Doesn't mean you got to stick to Freeman's work since the 80s. You can show evolution, of course, but signaling that that's the person you started with does a lot for a reviewer who knows the entire body of literature. As well, as we probably know but don't often think about, you are always writing a paper to essentially stand on the shoulder of giants. Everyone's done something, you read that person's work, and now you're trying to just do this. Make sure you acknowledge the people's work that you're standing on. Who is it that you are learned from X and now you're thinking this? This is where the right conversations, the right authors are really important because you're basing your argument around those people's work. And as well as reviewers, those are a high probability that they will be asked to review those papers.
And can I just add something there, Jordan? So quote the original source. Don't be afraid if it's a seminal piece of work, like Leisure's constraints theory. Don't quote somebody that's used it in 2023 and just applied it recently, because you don't want to quote the 1990 original source. So go back and show that you have read where that's come from, where it was originally developed, not where it's been applied or where it's been applied in sport or event or tourism. You know, social identity theory, any of the big theories, you should be going back to the origins when you're referencing, at least to start with. Then you can say from there where it's been applied.
Absolutely. And I think the quoting part's really key. I'll ask an open question. I'll answer it myself as well. Do you often struggle to see a concept you know everyone knows, but you're trying to say it and not say it the same way that everyone else has said it? Just quote the person that said it at the front. Your brain will love it, and all the reviewers will go, yep, check, awesome. This isn't a perfect template of how to do things, but there are certain ways that give you the reviewer check on what to do, okay? The final thing is length. Now this, of course, depends on everything we've talked about. You can see through some of our examples with the sources that you have 6 paragraphs from Brian's. You can have 3 or 4 from Melina's. Perhaps the Elsevier one turns into a 3 or 4 or 5. I think as a general rule of thumb, you shouldn't go beyond that second and a half page. You want to keep it tight. Of course, you need some space to have the conversation to start it. So it's not just going to be 1 page. It's not an abstract. But you definitely don't want to be going beyond that 3rd page. And that's where some of the examples we'll show in a second. You can have 6 paragraphs to say the same 3 main things, if that's how the story works. You can have 3 paragraphs say the same 3 things. But as long as you are working within a generally tight time frame, you're good to go. Yep, Harrison.
Are those 500 words done in double spacing? Is your assumption they're double spacing?
Oh, for the pages? Yes. Yeah, 500 words would be 500 words, double spaced or not. Yeah. All right, so cute little image just to show these are the concepts that come across everything. Key concepts need to be identified, whether it's in your title or introduction, both obviously preferred. Knowledge needed. What are the conversations happening? What are the things that you need to say up front? This is where the literature is. What's your hook? What's your gap? What's your, this is what needs to happen now? Awesome, you've told me that. That's great. So far, all you've told me is a phenomenal idea for me to do myself. Your study does it. Make that clear, and then give me enough insight to know that you actually can do this, or you've already done it and you will make a contribution, and then tell me that contribution. There's lots of debates in the contribution element about how much to put in there, how in depth to go. I think as long as you don't sell your story, but you make it clear that you can complete your story, that you're in a good spot to be. And we'll work through that a little bit more in a second. So key concepts, as I just said, I'll just kind of briefly go through. A lot of this writing is more so for the slides to be shared after. So concepts, theory, phenomena. Are they there? Are they defined? Are they properly defined by the reviewer or the reference you need to? Number 2, the knowledge needed. So what does a reviewer need to know? Of course, the reviewer is an expert in this area, but what does your general reader need to know about your topic? Is there something important about the story that needs to be told so they're aware for the future? It's a very challenging part to actually succinct all of the literature and to do so in a couple sentences. So as you're working through, as I constantly work through, it's okay if it takes you a long time to figure it out because you have a lot of research to synthesize into 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 sentences. The hook. What is novel about your study? What is that gap that you are going to do that's important? Explain why we need to know it. I often find, and Tracy, I'm sure you find the same, that people often say, we need to know this. Great, I can probably think through why we need to know that, but you didn't tell me that. I think explaining the hook to someone is just as important as identifying it, if not more. So it's very challenging though, in 1 sentence or 1 or 2 sentences to say what that hook is and why it's important for the study. I think when you can get that down, that is what I would call your linchpin that your entire paper centers around and you can constantly have throughout. It's that clear signal that I know that this is what is happening. And then when you tell me your results, that explains this. And I go, oh yeah, you answered your question. Number 4, your study. So this will be up to you, how much you wish to include or not. Read through journals to have an idea. I think you absolutely are okay to present a research question in an introduction. Some people might tell you that's not what you're supposed to do. I personally wouldn't include hypotheses if you're a quantitative person, but absolutely what question you're trying to embark on, include that. And then from there, can you provide a high-level overview of what you learned from this paper? Remember, back to our original slide, an introduction is not simply introducing key concepts. You're introducing your paper to the reader. It's okay to have 1 or 2 sentences that broadly tell you this is what we found. You don't have to give specifics, but you can say that you complete the story. You don't have to tell me the themes that your interviews determined, but you can tell me that you did answer the question you're trying to answer. And then finally, from there, you can provide that contribution. You've started with some big problem or some theory that needs to be contributed to. Tell me that you contributed to it. Explain in 1 or 2 sentences that what you set out to do is what you did, and this will actually advance the field. That was a lot, but any questions? As I said, the slides will be shared after, so you can look through things more in depth if you'd like to.
One of the things just on that is make sure that you're consistent. So if you say at the beginning, this study aims to, and then you don't come back to that again in the paper, then it's like, okay, you aim to do this, this, and this, worded quite specifically.
Yeah.
So where is that in your research questions? Or where is that in the way in which you approach the research problem? So just make sure you're consistent with whatever you put in the introduction, that there's follow through. I mean, we're only talking about the introduction today, but
whole paper.
Yeah, the whole paper should speak back to the introduction.
And I'm sure for you writing the paper, I know for myself, I know for my partner, whenever she politely listens to my papers, it sounds really boring. She's like, oh, you use Megasport event all the time. And I'm like, I know I do. That's the point. But for you, it might sound boring. For a reader, especially someone who's new to the literature that is going to read your published work, super helpful. For a reviewer, having wine or not having wine on a Friday night, really great signal to be like, yep, this is what it is. You just keep the reader kind of in your guidelines the whole time by doing that. So let's get to some examples. Oh, sorry, yeah.
I have read some of the introduction in there. They just start with the story and they tell the significance of the topic and research, that why it is important, and then it ends with the research question. So it leads us with the suspense to read the complete paper. So you said that you should mention your contribution in the introduction section as well. So these are the 2 things, like when you are writing contribution, you are actually telling that this is a snapshot of what we are going to study further. But when we are leaving with the research question, it's just like there is a suspense now, and what happens next? You need to read the whole paper to understand. And then there is a contribution section right after this discussion session there, where they explicitly tell you that these are the theoretical contributions or the practical contribution this paper has made. So my question is that what is the best approach to take it? Like I know that you have said that it depends upon the journal and the scope of the research as well. Like for the journal, like Journal of Retailing and Consumer Services, it's a marketing journal, and it mainly focuses on the retailing literature, and specifically it should be more of the practical side rather than more of the theoretical. So we should be discussing that how it is important for the industry. But for the journal like European Journal of Marketing, it would be looking into the theoretical aspect, and you should be making a more of the theoretical contribution to the literature, or how this important this paper would be important in theoretical aspects. So like when I am writing my research, I would be focusing on the both. So if someone in their early career, they want to publish in the both, what approach they should use? Though should they just tailor their introduction whenever they are submitting, or what would be the a journal approach to write an introduction when we are trying to write a paper or research?
Yeah, so okay. First of all, just to answer the research question part by finishing an introduction there, it certainly works. People obviously are published with it. My personal preference would be to finish your introduction. Now, that doesn't mean you need to state explicitly what your contribution is, but you can find a way in a sentence or two to say, by doing this, we advanced this contribution, X, Y, Z. So it's not necessarily in the first paragraph of, or sorry, in the introduction, I've now learned exactly what your contribution is, but I know that you have advanced the theory because you've introduced something new. And then I'm like, oh, I still have that suspense because I don't know what that new thing is, or I don't necessarily know how you got there or all the specifics of the contribution, but I do know that you contributed. So that's all that sort of is. In terms of how to play the navigation of practical or theoretical, I would first turn to the actual journal. Of course, as you said, if it's a European Journal of Marketing, it's theoretically based. Focus on the strong theoretical contribution. Doesn't mean your overall finish doesn't have practical implications, but what's that one contribution you want the reader to know? It's a practical-based journal, the opposite. It kind of connects to an idea, it's called presenter's paradox. Has anyone ever heard of presenter's paradox? So presenter paradox is essentially the idea that one strong thing matters more than the collection of two things, which actually adds up to greater value. So I'll give you an example. They did a study where they gave students a $5,000 tuition rebate. They also gave them $5,000 and $100 for books. They valued the $5,000 alone more. Logically makes no sense because it's $5,100. But when you start to add things together, people look at things collectively rather than just the one. Everyone's doing a paper. There's tons of practical implications and theoretical implications that can come from it, but you have one strong contribution that you're trying to make. That's what I would focus on for the intro without selling the farm, without giving away the whole story. Because then absolutely when you get to your contribution section, you can go into, yes, this means this for practice. Here's some examples, but it's probably not the main thing. And so the presenter's paradox component is when you tell me the 3 or 4 things you do, I don't think about them all as this is amazing and here's 3 nice ones. I just collectively look at it and I go, okay, cool, but I probably missed the main one. So that's actually a specific example from Brian Connolly's work. I've found it to be as well the same as I like just saying, here's the main contribution I'm going to do without explicitly saying what it is. But that way it connects to the title, it connects to the main narrative, the concepts. And now you as a reader, you're still having full of suspense, but you go, okay, this paper is going to do this for me. Does that answer it well?
Thank you.
Okay, so let's work through some introductions. So we got 2 sort of ways of doing this. So the first one, we've compiled paper from JSM and 2 from SMR. Shamelessly, Tracy leads one, I lead another, and then colleagues at Deakin lead the third one. The reason that we did this is we can speak to the papers, but also internally, we know through the review process, the introduction had barely any, if at all, revisions requested. So what I've done is these are the 3 papers. So Josh McLeod's work, Harrison, your comment about quotations, 7 weeks is not a lot of time, was taken from a participant and then built in. So it's a really nice way that it can be done. Tracy's work with psychological contracts, and then a mixed method review that I did. So each paper, and you can go through this in much more detail later, but what I've done is I've highlighted those key concepts that we've talked about, and I've bolded words that are purposefully used throughout them. So I get that it's probably tougher to see, but I will try and work through it. But what remains under search, however, is. So previous to that, Josh and colleagues have essentially said, we know these things. Here's that hook. Very clear way of doing it. Later on, the study seeks to expand understandings of how. He's told me how is the issue, how is what we're doing going forward, addressing this question. Now on the cusp, these things just seem like whatever, but addressing this question is an explicit formal way to say this is what I'm going to do, or this is what we're doing. In terms of bolding, you'll see that in the question, we have temporal institutional work bolded and inequitable institutions. For anyone that's on organization theory scholar in the room, institutions is a clear word. It can be defined in many ways if you're in the field or not. As you see in the second paragraph, the first thing he did, temporal institutional work. The first time that term came up, it's been defined. It's been defined as the original people in an AMJ paper that did in 2016. And to Tracy's earlier point, a quotation is involved. Makes it simple on everyone. We know what it is. And then that same language is used throughout. You see gender equity, slow, timing norms, change, institutions, urgently addressed. The word in that first paragraph of urgently addressed, I don't know if Josh did this purposely or not, but it does align really well with the timing component. That is a key concept in this paper. So you start to see is how everything sort of unfolds together.
Can I just make a point there as well, for people online? So if you look at that first sentence, what's really important to me, so this was published in 2024, was probably reviewed a few years before that. So they've got a recent reference when they're talking about a current situation. If you have that in, a sentence to say there's been no progress in gender equity, or there's been no progress in defining legacy or event legacy or whatever it is, and then you put a 1990 quote in there, I'm like,
You've missed a few decades.
yeah, and you would be surprised at how many people do that.
It's true.
So make sure if you're talking about currency that you put current work in.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so that's example one. Let's move to Tracy's example. So this is a paper in SMR. So as the title had, psychological contract, women athletes. There's more to it, but those are essentially your two key concepts. Psychological contract is a theory. The first time she brought it up in the introduction, again, she defines it. She defines exactly what it is and uses, I'm assuming, Rousseau's the seminal scholar for that. Interesting to know, if we just start with the middle paragraph, you have the words obligations, employer, and employee. And when we go down to the bottom, which is her question, our aim was to explore how semi-professional sportswomen experience and interpret their employers' expectations and obligations. Right there, the theory, even if you know nothing about it, perfectly fits the question she's looking to ask or looking to answer. Again, the highlights kind of unravel how traditionally been the domain of men. This is how we've constantly thought about it. Here's a new way that we need to consider. Here's our theory. While extant literature argues that, this premise is yet to be fully explored. We know this and this, but we don't know this. We've made a clear argument. So when you strip away all the words, the introductions, the concepts that we're talking about in the previous few slides are still very prevalent. Anything else to add to your introduction? No?
It's perfect.
Perfect, yeah. Okay, and then a third example. So this is my mixed method review. Same kind of idea. Mixed method, we all think we know. I thought I knew it. The first time I say it, which is in the second paragraph, I then define it right away, and I use the seminal scholar's definition essentially for where that comes from. At the start, I explained that our field's massive and it's growing and we have complex issues, and that requires complex methods, hence mixed method review. So we've built into this. I've also talked about how, while we know a lot about qualitative and quantitative research, specifically through some special issues, we haven't looked at mixed methods. So we know X and Y, and we know complexity is important, but we haven't considered this. This is defined as this, therefore we did this. Okay. So again, when you strip away all the words, the concepts are still the same. So I'll just kind of leave that there for a second. Does anyone have questions? Does anyone want to think through the examples or anything? Or good. Nothing online, Ellie? Can you ask the person if online that answered their question? The previous one about examples.
One thing I would say, well, she's answering online. So reviews. Now, a lot of you as HDR candidates will probably think, oh, my first paper that I'm going to publish is going to be a systematic literature review or a scoping review. Now, 5 years ago, journals loved these because they weren't very common. They were highly cited in the journal, really got your impact factor up. We've been flooded with systematic quantitative reviews, scoping reviews, every sort of review that you can think of. If you are going to present a review and you don't want it to be desk rejected, make sure that you, in this, your introduction, you're very clear about it's moving the field beyond just gathering a whole bunch of articles, putting them through a process, and then spitting them out at the end to say, oh, well, X number of authors in this field are from sociology, and X number are from this country, or X number are men and women. So you do need to move the field beyond what it currently is if you're going to go down that track. I only put it in because I know some journals now are just saying
No to reviews.
no to that overall systematic review submission.
Just out of curiosity, how many of you have essentially done a review or are looking to do a review, whether it's to be published or not, as part of your PhD? Yeah, that's cool. I did as well. I would think what I would add to Tracy's point is sport, we're in like year 30-ish of JSM being started.
Yeah.
So the last 10 years has kind of been a great time period for people to go, hey, we've gotten 20, 25 years of research. What's going on in this field? There's kind of temporality with that. As she said, that means a lot of people are now starting to do them. A lot become try to be really specific or niche, and it's still just on understanding what's been done. One of Academy Management Journal's annals specifically calls their reviews that they look for reviews with an attitude. And I think that's fair to say is what our field's looking to do more of. Awesome, you reviewed this, but what does that tell us about where we need to go? What conversations need to happen? It's no longer just about the descriptives, as Tracy pointed out. And making that clear in your introduction, for example, that can be the contribution that you're looking to do. So it's not just, yep, we described what's happened, but based on this, we analyzed X and we suggest field level discussions on this and this and this. So, apologize for the small screens. Through conversations with Ellie earlier, she thought, I think I proposed this, but she really supported it, that it would be great to show an example of a working introduction from wherever it started to how it's currently at. So I'm working on a paper, it's a paper with a colleague at Deakin who's in that OB space. And I just thought it's been a bit of a headache in a great way, but I've tried to work my way back and compile photos of the stages it's gone through, the revisions, and somewhat talk about my thought process throughout it without getting too in detail. So as a general idea, the paper is trying to compare two theories to understand a phenomenon we don't really know much about. Okay, so essentially, from an event lens, without giving too much away, events are created, people's attitudes change. We often look at their attitudes of the event, but we don't think about their attitudes towards external things, specifically like social change or social issues oriented things, despite events having that focus. So I was having this conversation with Andrew's his name, and he's like, oh, how are you doing that? And I was like, well, I got two theories that we talk about, and I just threw them both in the survey because why not? I figured I'd figure it out later. And he's like, well, that's great because here's a paper I just read in some management journal, and he's like, they kind of do the same thing with their own phenomenon, and here's a way to do it. I was like, okay, great. So I started with this template paper. So going back to one of my previous comments, I read the paper not for the content, it's about mergers and acquisitions. I read it to understand the format, to understand how they introduced theories, how they built this narrative. And then I started with the ABT method. We know X and Y, but we don't know Z. Therefore, and this is important because, therefore, we're going to do this. And painfully to admit, this page takes a lot of time to figure out because I often start with like 12 dot points about the things we know, and then I learn how to compile it into the 1 or 2 or 3 things. And then I know what we don't know, but trying to explain that in 1 to 6 sentence is not the easiest thing. So it takes time to get there and to get to what looks like a measly 4 or 5 lines on a piece of paper. From there, I start to build out structure. So I kind of think through specifically Brian Connolly's example, but just the paragraph example. What am I trying to say in paragraph 1? It's now the first part of the A, perhaps the second paragraph is the second part of the A, then I got my however paragraph, this is what I'm gonna do, and these are the contributions I think I'm gonna make. And I start to piece out some paragraphs, and I'm a dot point person. I write dot points in my writing. And then when I get to a point in that point, I don't know what to say, I go to the next line and I tab over and I create all the different things I think might work. I do this for words as well. Sometimes I'll write a sentence and the sentence will begin and I don't know what the word to say. So I put a blank space there and then I keep going. Because sometimes it's so easy to just get caught up on, lots of head nods. We've all experienced the same thing. So that's me starting to create the structure from what was endlessly trying to figure out the paper in 4 sentences. Then I build out my paragraphs more and more. And I start to have that narrative and I'm constantly checking, going back and forth, making sure it aligns with that linchpin sentence that is the entire paper. Then I eventually developed a draft. Now, Andrew was away for a little bit, so I just sent it to a colleague for fun. And I was like, hey, can you give me a friendly review? This person's in sport. He was like, yep, here's some things to think through. You didn't define this, you defined this. Classic variable move. Probably the linchpin of my entire conversation. I put as a note, as a footnote. I don't know why I did that, but I did that. And he's like, mate, your whole thing's down here that no one's going to read. And I was like, oh yeah, I should put that in there. So I reworked it. And then I developed the second draft. This is the first one that went to the co-author. And then you can see the amount of revisions that were requested, which was great because it stimulated conversation because we come from very different perspectives. So he's like, well, why did you do this? And it was like, oh, like, well, let's think through it this way. Also, one thing that I loved is his perspective being outside of our field. He's like, why are you using this term? Or what does this term mean? So it really made me focus in on the right way of thinking about certain things and developing our argument. That then turned into the third developed draft. Same feedback by Andrew's phase 8. And as you can see, there's a lot less color, right? So that's great. We're making some moves and things are going well. And we're just starting to think through little things. For maybe a week, we debated the 2 types of perspectives that we're going to call these things. Because we want to make sure that the words encapsulated what they actually meant. But we also know we were introducing a new word to the field. It's not something that we can define. So how can we say this really simply and people get that word and they recognize it as they keep going? Then from there, we developed a draft. We were both really happy with it. And so we submitted an abstract. So if anyone's at SMANS at the end of the year, come and listen to our paper. No, I'm just joking. But just as an idea, that is essentially where we got to just create the introduction. This is the paper I was talking about at the beginning where it took months of building the intro. But then the last month, I've just written the rest of it because it's pretty much all there. That first section helps a lot. Okay. So I just kind of wanted to show this, and I'm happy to go into any questions you may have about this with the process of writing, but show that it's not just a template and then you write your paper. It's not fun. We're all challenged in doing different parts of writing. Working with people is extremely helpful from the start, especially friendly reviews. Yeah, does anyone have questions? I can flip through. I just want to show an example. Yeah.
It's a workshopped question, but it's just something that's in my mind that I wrestle through with my PhD. So my name's Sarah. I'm 2.5 years in. I'm just thinking about the future publications of my study. My study's on the international women's soccer players. In academia, we use terms like migrant, and that's something where I wrestle with that term as a player. Like terms such as international or visa player is more common. Understanding the confines of submitting a paper for an academic audience, a journal, academic journal, how much leeway is there in being able to be, how can I say this, taking a step back from terminology that has been used historically to be able to perhaps make a shift or a slight shift, like how much is there a give and take? And I'm not, the international term is just one example, but I'm just talking about language and jargon per se. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's just something that I think I'm wrestling with when I'm looking ahead to submitting, because that's also not necessarily my first language, let's say.
Yep. So
I don't know if you have advice for that, or if that's something that, like papers that you've seen, that's, you're like, like that's not quite, what we're looking for. They should be speaking in this kind of way for them to be accepted or considered in amongst this audience, this prestigious audience, if you will.
Yeah.
Prestigious.
Yeah. I would say, and this might just be my opinion, Tracy, you tell me if you think otherwise. If you're going to use a term, as long as you can define it and you can logically explain why that's the way to do it, you're good. It might, and if it's counter to the previous literature, say that and explain why you're using your term. it's okay, as I'm kind of assuming from here, that we use terms that are dated. And there's probably a more reasonable understanding of why we use a different term. Your paper's not about introducing the term, but it's a nice 2 sentences to say, this is what we're going to use because X, so I'll use it. And then the reviewer now is signaled to know, but you've also made a really cool contribution as well in doing that.
Yeah, and you just need to be cognizant of the terms that are used in the journal or the field that you're working with. So a colleague from myself, Alison Doherty, and from Canada, myself from Australia, we were on a large 3-year European research grant looking at newly arrived migrants' sport participation in European countries. Now, that's not a term that we would use in Australia or Canada, but it was a term that was used in the European context. So publishing that work, you just have to make clear that the terminology is contextual to where the study is taking place. And to the way in which your participants or your participating organizations could understand that terminology. The other thing I'd say, and this is something that's a bit of a, I don't know, a bugbear for me, is that if you're doing research with the population or in a different language, I really like to see that if you have terms that have emerged from the interviews that you've done in whatever language it is or whatever cultural context, if there's no direct English translation, don't translate it. If there's a lot of words, and I'm sure, you know, we've got people from different cultural backgrounds here, you can say, well, in German, this word is used, and there's no equivalent word in English. And it has a particular meaning in the context that I'm conducting my research. Keep it in. You never know. It might then become the word that is used going forward for the next generations to describe that particular phenomena. So look at what story you're trying to tell, how you're trying to tell it, and use the terms that are going to be appropriate for that. That said, I was in the UK a couple months ago and running a seminar for ECRs, and someone said, I got a paper to review. You know, I'm a Black woman of Asian background. I got the paper to review from this leading tourism journal, and it used this particular word throughout. And I was really offended. And I wrote to the editor and said, I'm not reviewing this paper because this term is used. And I never heard back. And then the paper got published. And it's like these things, you know, sometimes happen, but you think about your audience and who's going to read it as well and what that term is going to mean to them, because we don't want to be offensive, but we don't want to cover what historical terminology may be used to emphasize particular points. I think we're seeing that a lot around this decolonization of our fields. So just being sensitive to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Is it qualitative research? Do your participants tell you what they would like to be referred to as?
I ask. It's just based on, it's an autoethnography as well, so I'm an international women's soccer player too.
Okay. So what would you like to be called?
International
There you go.
player is fine, but yeah, like I said, migrant to me, I know it's used in literature, so I don't want to, I also want to question why am I using that word just because it's always been said in that way. So that's where I'm at.
I think that's great. I think you have every rationale to name that. That's how you want to be named. I also think you've hit a great nail on the head. Like, the reality is we're all researchers, and the point of what we're doing is to challenge assumptions.
Yeah.
So you're doing that. And
I think, sorry.
No, I was just saying, if we've used a word for so long, yeah, that's how we thought about it, but we maybe not critically thought about it. So if you're, and also an autoethnography allows you the opportunity to actually provide that critical personal insight.
I was just gonna add, I think the concern is also when we're talking about, like, I haven't published significantly, but when looking at keyword searches and so on, is that going to bite me by using words that are less commonly searched, for example? So I think about that from, I guess, a reviewer's standpoint as well, perhaps, if that's something that they would be against.
Yes. I don't think it would bite you, but I do think if migrant is the specific concept of your study and you use a different word, that could be problematic with reviewer selection, but not in the way that you're talking about it, I don't think.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd be more concerned if you were like, I'm going to use a theory and call it something different. That's, yeah. Yes, Mel.
And I would, hi. I would also think that you potentially could be more highly cited
Yeah.
for using something that, because you have, like, if I read something in your case for using that word as opposed to others, and I was working within that field, I'd go, oh, well, I'm going to use that term because that sits, your reasoning sits more nicely. So I would cite you. Yeah. So vice versa, while it might potentially work against you, it actually could work for you.
Thank you, that's helpful. Thank you.
I think that aligns with both what Mel and Tracy saying, is like you're kind of injecting your authenticity in the paper, which before even knowing it was an autoethnography, I would absolutely support. But the fact that it is an autoethnography, like it should be you on the paper. So yeah, that's what I would say to that. All right. Yes, sorry, Simon. Yeah.
I'm Sam from Swinburne, and so in your opinion, when is the best time to write introduction? So often things that the introduction comes after everything is done, so at the last. But yeah, I'm just wondering how senior researchers do.
I'm not a senior researcher.
Jordan, take it.
I'll take the ECR route over here.
Okay, when Jordan showed me the structured method, I just felt fell on the floor. I've never used it. He's so organized. It's personal preference to a large degree, but generally you'll always come back and rewrite an introduction. You might have a skeleton to start with, but then you're going to come back and make sure that it is really impactful, because that is the first thing that people read and form impressions. So that's what needs the most refinement. A lot of the other parts of your paper are going to be fairly standard, right? Your method, your findings, the results.
Yeah.
You know, your discussion, of course, is one that you'll probably go back over a number of times. But again, you know, the introduction, it's just like writing your PhD. You'll come back to the introduction at some point before you submit. But your supervisor will no doubt say, don't agonize over it too much at the beginning, because you're going to revisit it. You've got to let it go at some point and then come back.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard people say, senior scholars, not myself, who have basically started writing a paper at different spots throughout their career. Some people are like, I start with the methods because I can't change it. And then like, I write the results because they're the results. And then they can build up their argument. If you, for some people that start with like a grant, for instance, you kind of already know the introduction because you've had to build it out. Personally, I used to struggle starting with an introduction when I didn't talk about what the study was or the contributions in the intro, because I would just have my argument. And then I would actually go write the rest of the paper, and I'd come back and I'd change it a lot. Currently, I kind of write intros where I do the introduction and I include a little bit of my study and a little bit of my contribution. And what I find is that actually sets up like my laneways for the future sections. As Tracy said, the methods is what it is. The results is what it is. My discussion, my theory literature review, they're essentially already framed because my introduction's there. So personally, that's why I spend so much time on it and I build it out that way, because so in this paper, there's two theories. I need to talk about theory 1 and theory 2, and I need to explain how they're going to answer my question. And then my discussion, I'm going to talk about how theory 1 did it and theory 2 and our integrated theories do it. And that leads to my contributions, which have already been signaled at the front. So it's kind of like a way of me figuring that out, and it helps me there. But for other people, you may start elsewhere because that helps you build the introduction. So does that help it? Is that good? All good? Okay. How are we doing for time, Ellie? I have no
We
idea.
have 12 minutes.
Perfect. Look at that. Love building slides and not testing it, and it works out perfect. All right, so we're just going to go through some strategies, lessons, reflections, and then we can, of course, talk about anything. So some of the strategies that we've kind of talked about and we'll talk about more, for me, is to simplify your writing. We all love big words. I love big words. It's fun to write. It's fun to sound smart. I sound like the most lay language person when I begin writing my papers. In the politest way possible, I will only continue an argument if I can explain it to my partner. And she doesn't want to read any of my writing, so I'll tell her the example in the couple sentences, and she goes, yeah, that sounds good. I'm like, okay, well, if you think it's good, that means I know I can write it to be actually good. But that means the idea has traction, basically. So I always start with, whether it's a dot point or anything, I don't try and say the academic language. And it's like, we know a lot about events. We know a lot about outcomes. We know a lot about this and this. Then I know I can filter in the proper words, but I'm just trying to get my ideas there. And then, as I've said, I use a dot point strategy. I'm a very simple thinking person. So for me, knowing this point is helpful. And then I can start to structure my points into sentences, and I can start to structure those dot point sentences into paragraphs. So it helps me, instead of thinking macro-wise, to focus micro, which just resonates with the whole simple style. The other thing, and I hope this was noted in the example I gave, is embrace reviewer opportunities early and often. And I don't mean go just to your supervisor or randomly email an associate editor. Your friends, your partners, your parents, someone on the coffee shop street that you're looking to have a conversation with. Anyone can be helpful in any time, okay? So just back to my paper, for instance, I started the idea by asking my partner what she thought about it. And I knew that I had traction there. I had a bit of an idea. I wrote a draft, and I sent it to a colleague who could then provide a friendly review. And then my co-author, of course, is also providing reviews as we're collectively working together. Those are parts of it. But there's always opportunities to embrace reviewer kind of flexibility, or sorry, friendly type reviews. But I feel like, Tracy, correct me if you think differently, people often shy away from them, because it's kind of like you have this awesome idea and you're writing it and it's the best thing ever. But then the second you have to show someone, it's terrifying to think that through. Does that sound somewhat? No? Yeah, okay. So I would highly encourage those to just share ideas, whether it's just your ABT. Like when I was a PhD student in Melina's lab, I guess we call it, there's 3 of us, and we all had to get up and just say what our ABT was. And it's terrifying, but it was also really helpful, because then you just learn from a couple people their thoughts. Did you actually get your thought across? Horizontal linkages, which are basically the people in this room. So there's lots of insights around, we want senior scholars to help us and things like that. But there's just as much benefit in going to someone who's also a PhD student or early career scholar and saying, hey, here's my 3 sentences for the paper I'm looking to do. Does this make sense to you? If it makes sense, you get that clear check to be like, yeah, I'm on the right path. Because if your 3 sentences are right, your 10,000 words aren't going to be right. So if you can get your 3 sentences right, you're good to go. Anything else to add? And then finally, and this is, I'll call on Tracy for this because it's a big point that she brought up, and I agree, is being able to build your narrative. So you're all PhD students, you're all leading your research. That is such an important thing to keep doing as you're going forward, especially in your topic areas. I don't think it's talked about enough necessarily. It matters a lot when it comes to publishing, jobs, etc. But a strategy outside of the specific points of writing is to make sure that what you're writing is the argument, is the narrative that you want to be leading, especially as external things become more and more important.
Yeah, and this is probably a real challenging part for PhD students, because unless you're doing PhD by publication, yeah, a couple, you're having to synthesize a large body of work into that 3 pages for your introduction. And you just need to have that focus, that line of argumentation that makes sense. Often you see when a PhD student submits their first paper that it's just trying to do too much, or it's been a cut and paste. Okay, I can take this, I can take this. You really need to make sure that you have that consistent voice that goes through to tell the story that Jordan's been talking about.
All right, so some lessons. We have lots of lessons because we've both failed and succeeded with several things. So I think just the overwhelming point to make is that writing is hard and writing is a journey, and that we all experience quote unquote writer blocks, or not knowing what a word is, or constantly having Oxford Dictionary up on one of your screens like I do because you're trying to remember what things mean. It's okay and it's a part of what you're doing. If it's not hard, it's probably not something that's actually worth kind of continuing to do. So first and foremost, just a bit more philosophical, but absolutely embrace your journey. I know the seats you guys are sitting in right now as PhD students is not fun at all times. I know writing the introduction for the 17th time from your supervisor is not always as enjoyable as it was the first time, but it is a journey and it continues to excel and get better in doing that. Some more specific ones is it's okay to be wrong. Whether it's your own work or you're working with co-authors, it's okay to have an idea and think it's the best thing in the world and fight and fight and fight and find out it's not. The idea is still the start of something. It will get you somewhere. But just because you thought of it and it hasn't been friendly reviewed or hasn't been really engaged in an argument doesn't mean it's perfect. So embrace the opportunity for your idea to turn into something more than that. Nothing you write cannot be improved upon, which is kind of controversy to the bottom, but it's okay. And this again is kind of me trying to signal that embrace friendly reviews. You have something, you've worked really hard. It doesn't mean it's bad. It doesn't mean it's great. It only means it can improve and it will improve. And that doesn't mean that what someone tells you is what you need to do. You might, as case in point in my example, you might get a whole page back of track changes. But then you find out that most of those things are just from you guys talking different languages, which actually inserts what you should be saying and why. And it gives you more of a grounds to work through that review process. The next point is perfection is the enemy of publication. So while yes, you absolutely can make things better and better and better, at some point in time, it's good to be published. You'll have your proofs later on. You can work through reviews. I don't know if I fully agree with this. Tracy, you tell me otherwise, but Milena used to say an author does like 90% of the work on the first submission, and then you engage in the review process, and that's the last 10. That doesn't mean that you submit a 90% completed document. It means that you complete what you think is 100%, and then you strongly engage in the review process to make it that much better. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think sometimes it's more than 10%.
Yeah, sometimes, honestly, she said 80-20, but yeah.
You're going to submit something that's your best work, but it's never going to be perfect. So you do have to let it go at some point in time. But if you put in something, and I'm sure we've all experienced this as reviewers and editors, that is substandard, then that in itself sends a message to the journal editors, the reviewers, that you don't take enough care. And you'd be surprised at some of the most experienced reviewers that win all these awards for reviewing. And what do they hone in on? If it's not APA 7th, basically,
That's so true.
I'm sure you know who I
Yep.
mean. So make sure that you put your best foot forward, because Jordan said we're only human. If you get something you think, okay, am I going to just reject it? Or if I'm going to send it out to review, if I send it out to review, look, it needs a firm hand. So I might send it to a different set of reviewers than if it was really well crafted and you're looking for higher level feedback. So as journal editors, we make some of those decisions as well.
Yeah, and that's where if we circle all the way back to the initial reviewer threshold, that introduction, it's okay if you missed a small thing or two in the literature review, or maybe you should have had an extra robustness test in your methods, or whatever the case may be. But because you wrote that introduction so well, as a reviewer, I'm confident that when I tell you, hey, you need to expand on your conversation of so-and-so, or you're missing this important element, that's okay, and you will include it because I have the confidence that you will do that. And that's where those things become helpful, and that tinkering process is really important in the review stage. So as Tracy began at the start, is not to overpromise and to underdeliver. which I can personally say I think is an extreme challenge when you're in those big projects like a PhD, because you have this massive contribution you're trying to make, and it becomes your life work for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and it is a big deal. And then when you whittle it down into one paper, sometimes that can get lost in a different way. So I think what's just an important thing to consider is you are not writing your dissertation and sending that to Journal of Sport Management. You're writing a paper for Journal of Sport Management that comes from your dissertation. Think of it differently. Think of it as the contribution you're trying to make through that paper, not the entire dissertation you made. It might be one contribution for the dissertation that goes into it, but they're not the same things. Important.
Can I just add something there too, which some of you will do multiple studies within your PhD. The worst thing that you can do in your introduction and say, this paper is one part of a larger study.
Yeah, don't do that.
Which looked at blah, and then you don't talk about the larger study at all again, but you're just presenting this one very narrow slice, which the reviewer might think, how thin are they slicing that salami? Like, how many papers are they trying to get out of one study? And then it may not hang together as well. So that, and it may under-deliver in that respect. Because you said, it's part of this wonderful big study, but I'm only going to give you this little bit of it.
And that's, I think that I personally experienced that. I think it aligns really well with how PhDs are done. Like, a few of you doing it by publication, you almost have set in your head from the start, you're expected to do 3 publications from it, and all of those are going to go to great journals. That's how you get your dissertation. That's not necessarily how you publish. It's entirely okay if you have one phenomenal contribution from your dissertation that is one mega paper, and it's beautiful, and it's everything that's you as a narrative. I would almost encourage that over trying to slice and dice to have 3 or 4 papers in journals that might not be helping you in the same way that another journal could. I personally experienced doing I probably wish I would do like one really strong one or 2 versus that mindset. But it just kind of hones back in that your dissertation is not your published work. It's a clear distinction on getting the 3 letters beside your name versus getting lines on your CV. Yeah.
Quick question. How do you navigate differentiating your introduction section when you're doing a conference paper, a journal, and also doing my PhD by publication? How do you mix it up without, synonym, blah, blah? Because you kind of are needing to say the same thing over and over again in some cases.
So are these introductions specifically for papers in your dissertation or perhaps for later on?
Yeah, either or.
Okay. For the dissertation, I think you're kind of starting in the same place, so it can be hard, but I would circle back to the reality that each paper is supposed to have a distinct contribution. So it depends on the system and the school and the supervisor. My experience and perspective is your publications in your dissertation don't answer your dissertation. It's like you have this overarching purpose and you have 3 questions, let's call it, and each paper answers a question. But the collection of those 3 answers your purpose. So it's going to have overlap, of course, because it's similar context, similar general arguments, but there should be a specific reason as why you're building that argument. So I would challenge you to try and think through the question specifically and work backwards, because there's probably nuances in the intro that are really important, and that's probably what needs to be focused on. All right, and then so last thing, so avoid making universal statements. No one is paradigm shifting as much as we would like to believe. And focus on the broader contribution. Don't get stuck in the weeds. Your study is extremely important, and it is something specific and niche that contributes to a broader cause. And that is probably the most important part of what you're doing. Is you're not looking to have 20 people repeat your study. You're looking to advance the field's work in general.
Yeah, and so in your introduction, keep it, obviously you're going to say what your research questions are, your aim is, and build your context, but don't get into the precise context of your study in that introduction, that you are doing this research on this specific event at this particular time period in this particular city. I mean, that can come out later on in the paper when you're looking at context or method. Don't put it in your introduction and don't go into huge detail about that at the beginning, because that's not the important thing.
Exactly. I think that actually might help you a bit is if you do get too stuck in the weeds too early, then all the intros start to look the same. But the contribution you're making is different, even though it might come from the same general context. All right, and then our last one, some reflection. So I've kind of said this throughout, and as I also started with, I enjoy quotes. Much of my best work, or at least what I think is my best work, is the rewriting of things begun years earlier. I've told Ellie this story and she laughed at me, and I've told other people this story and they also laugh at me. The best thing I had for my dissertation, thankfully it's a paper currently in JSM. I initially submitted to SMR, got bad reviews that were like, yep, this is wrong, you're doing things. Now in my head, I'm like, well, I just finished my PhD and it passed through my committee, which has experts on it. I'm like, this can't be right. So I just resubmitted to ESMQ. Not a strong strategy to do, especially when you get the same reviewer who says that. Doesn't work out too well. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna take, this is also time frame, finishing school, trying to defend my dissertation, bartending way too many hours and just trying to like make a living basically. I was like, okay, I'm gonna put this on pause. So I decided to start from scratch and rewrite the whole thing. And what I quickly realized is that my idea was strong and it was great, but I was using 2018, 2019 Jordan's writing. And I was like, well, I've clearly advanced a bit in the last 4 years. My thinking certainly advanced, so I should just rewrite it. So I rewrote the paper, supervisors had a little bit of feedback to help refine it, and it essentially got minor revisions the first time. And that's an awesome, successful story, but the moral is that it's okay and it's really important to know that your ideas are good and that you can always advance them in better ways. And that's where I would stick to the importance of rewriting, but also rereading. I have recently started rereading papers more and more. I think I read like the same paper 4 times this year, and every time I've read it, it's because I'm thinking about something different or I learned something different that helps me. Whereas I know it's really easy to read, check, and just kind of go forth that way. So that would be my biggest reflection, is the importance of doing those things and rereading and rewriting for what your purposes are, because there are so many of them. And then just collectively, what we hopefully have presented today is that a strong introduction will help you successfully navigate the review process. It will get you through that initial threshold. You'll be able to work with the reviewer and hopefully have successful publications going forward. And as well as Tseng and I had a conversation with, it will begin to form the subsequent sections of your paper. Right? It starts to tell you what the methods will look like, what the results, what the contributions, etc. Anything else to add, Tracy? Awesome. So that is our phase 1, if you will. We'll make sure the slides are shared. Ellie will do communication, and then we'll go from there for phase 2.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Obviously, we've had a great session there. Thank you. It was very informative, even for me, as a very newly will be submitting, hopefully by the end of this month. But with that being said, I'm conscious that everyone online has been sat down for a while as well. So we will be restarting again at 4:15 New Zealand time and 2:15 Australia time. So do keep that in mind. That will be for student presentations. If you do have any questions in the meantime, then please obviously pop them in the chat. I'll keep a track on that. There is an online networking session that will start as well in approximately 10-15 minutes. So if you are interested in doing that for our online students, then by all means jump online, stay online, and just drop us a message in the chat if you are interested in doing that networking session. If you are interested in submitting an introduction, that is something that we will follow up post-conference, and that will be an opportunity to provide an introduction for a journal article and have that be reviewed by obviously the group of higher academics, editors, as well, to give you a little bit of detailed feedback that might be external to your panels, to your supervisors, and just for a little bit of friendly feedback, as we already mentioned. So again, communications will go out about that post-conference, but in the meantime, enjoy your break and I'll see you all shortly.